Hi everybody. Today we want to talk about a topic that surprisingly, at least to me, I get asked about a fair bit. And that is cremation and what the Bible teaches about cremation. I should say right off the top that my thanks go to Pastor Jeff White, a friend of mine who has provided me with some material for this, and we were in some dialogue about the topic, so thanks Jeff for that. Cremation is certainly on the rise. In 1962, only about 5% of Canadians were cremated. By next year, that's anticipated to be around half. So this is a popular topic. The word cremate comes right from the Latin word cremare, meaning to burn. So that's basically what it is. Bodies are burned at a high temperature until there is really nothing left but ash. The question we want to face today is what the Bible teaches about this in terms of the Christian and the idea of cremation for the Christian versus burial. Cremation has been around a fairly long time. I was surprised to learn this. By 800 BC in Greece, 600 BC in Rome, cremation was very popular. But in ancient Israel, one of the ways that God had Israel stand out from her neighbors was that she pretty well stayed exclusively with burial. The early church also rejected cremation, mostly because it was associated with the pagan societies of Greece and Rome. Christians tended to bury their dead, either in catacombs or in typical graves. The Bible references burial a lot, maybe up to 180 times, everywhere from in a cave to under a tree, in the desert, in a garden, in a field. It's fairly extensive. We see the patriarchs are buried. Abraham buried Sarah. Jacob died in Egypt but asked to be buried in Canaan, and he was, as was Joseph. Joshua was buried. Samuel was buried. King David was buried. We see, interestingly, in Deuteronomy 34, in a fascinating passage, that when Moses died, God buried him. So God has had a role in an actual burial, and we see, of course, in the New Testament, in the Gospels, that Jesus was buried. Now, in terms of cremation, the Bible doesn't so much address cremation specifically, but it does often show fire in terms of judgment for the wicked. We see in 1 Samuel 31 that Saul and his sons, after having fallen away from the Lord, are burned. Achan in Joshua 7, who disobeyed the Lord and stole some of the tributes of war, or some of the spoils of war rather, he and his possessions were burned. We see in Amos 2, talks about Moab's judgment because they had burned the bones of Edom's king. Sodom and Gomorrah, of course, where a fire fell from heaven in judgment. Moses burned the golden calf as a judgment. Number 16 talks about 250 Israelites who rebelled against Moses and Aaron were destroyed by the fire that fell from heaven. An interesting passage about rebelling against spiritual leaders. Luke 9 is another really interesting passage where a Samaritan town rejects Jesus' message, and the disciples, in all of their graciousness, want to call fire down from heaven and burn them all. So much for grace there. And then we see, of course, in Revelation that the lake of fire represents the final destiny of not just the satanic trinity, but also of those whose names are not found in the book of life. So fire represents judgment very often in the scriptures. For heathens, of course, there is no resurrection, so pagans often cremated their dead, but Christians buried their dead in hopes of a resurrection, similarly as did the Jews. In terms of the body, our body, the Bible teaches, of course, that we are created in God's image. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. Our bodies are always highly valued in the scriptures, our actual flesh. Paul combats Gnosticism, which devalues the body all of the time when he says, offer your body in terms of service to God. Paul in Corinthians 15 teaches that just like a seed that has to be sown in the ground and it dies before newness of life rises from it. So we will be sown in the ground and raised immortal. We are going to be resurrected and redeemed bodily, as Christ was resurrected bodily. We see water baptism in Romans 6 is a picture of burial and resurrection for those who practice baptism by immersion. Paul is talking there about being put under and coming up, just like our bodies are buried and resurrected. So that's a very fast trip through biblical teaching on the body, resurrection, and the imagery of fire. So where does that leave us today? Well, I would say, of course, the Bible doesn't specifically address cremation, so you're not going to find a verse that says, don't be cremated, you must be buried. So when that happens, we look to biblical principles, as you've heard me teach before, for guidance. And of course, every believer has the Holy Spirit living inside to help us on this issue. I would say the weight of biblical evidence is pro-burial and anti-cremation. But again, the Bible gives no direct evidence. So this is one of those things you are going to need to weigh out with the principles of the Scriptures, as I've shown, but also with the guidance of the Holy Spirit that every one of us has inside. I hope this helped. If it does, feel free to share it, and I look forward to your comments, questions, arguments, any debates in the section below.